What do I have if I don't have you, Jesus? What in this life could mean anymore? You are my rock, you are my glory, you are the lifter of my head.
Well, welcome to Finding Freedom, and what I want to do to begin this whole series is just introduce you and just tell you a little bit about Finding Freedom. I presently work in an addiction treatment center, Tamarack Rehab. I've been there for 5 years. Before that, I was a pastor for 10 years. And so, kind of out of a bunch of needs that I saw in people I dealt with, Finding Freedom was born. And it's really based on 3 foundational things. And the first is this, that all of us, no matter where we come from, are broken. Some are more broken than others, but we're all broken people. And so we meet here at Finding Freedom on very even ground. There's nobody that's better than anybody else. This is something that we all have issues and we all need to deal with. The second thing that is very important to understand is that we make no apology in saying that Jesus is our higher power. We will not push that down anybody's throat. Our policy is not to do any arm twisting. But we want to be very clear that we will talk freely about Jesus as the higher power and just ask that people have an open mind to consider the fact that maybe this is the person I need to have as my higher power. The final thing that I want to say is my approach in all of this is going to be threefold. I will be using the 12 steps developed by AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, in their attempt to help people know how to find recovery. And then I will blend with that all of the stuff that I use in an addiction treatment center, and Tamarack is second stage. And what that means where we live is second stage is you deal with all of the underlying issues. So the addiction is not even the main problem. It's a symptom of deeper problems. And unless I deal with the deeper problems, I'm going to keep going back to the addiction. And so every day I work with people on all the underlying issues that cause them to have problems in life that they've been trying to solve with drugs and alcohol, gambling, sex, porn, shopping, whatever. All of those things become ways to try and solve the deeper issue problems. And the third thing that we'll combine is the teaching of Christianity, which will blend so beautifully and so well to show the answers and to confirm what many people in recovery have discovered. So for today, we are going to begin with step 1, which says we admitted we were powerless over drugs and alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. And what I want to talk about over the next few sessions is, what does it mean to be powerless? Am I really powerless? So many people say, I think maybe I can control my using, or I can control this area of my life. And they come to the point and they finally say, no, I'm powerless. But what does that mean? And so I want to look at this whole subject from a physical point of view, that I am powerless physically, then a psychological, and finally a spiritual perspective. So much of what I'm going to say today is based on all the research that's happened in the last 10 years. Ever since we've been able to do brain scanning, the whole world of addictions has opened up. And we've understood so much more because now we can look inside the brain and see what's actually going on there. And so just to give you some perspective, I want to show you a healthy brain. A healthy brain is what you see there through SPECT imaging, which is probably the newest form of brain imaging. And there is a brain that's had 2 years of cocaine. And those aren't literal holes in the brain. They're just parts of the brain that aren't working right now because of the damage done by cocaine. And so to a machine, it looks like that there's a hole there. That's crystal meth. Crystal meth is very similar in what it does to the brain as what cocaine or crack does, but it even does greater damage. And that's marijuana. And that's only 4 joints a week. And marijuana has been touted as the safe drug. It's the natural herb type of thing. And since we've been able to do brain imaging, we've seen just how much damage marijuana actually does in the brain. There's ecstasy. And that picture was shown to a neurologist who said that is the brain of somebody who's had multiple strokes. That's the kind of damage and where the damage is located. And ecstasy right now is, in our city, is the most common drug in high schools outside of alcohol and pot. And that brings us to the favorite and most common drug, alcohol. And that's 17 years, and that's just a weekend warrior. That's not even daily use. And that's due to the fact that alcohol, being a liquid gets into the spinal fluid and permeates every aspect of the brain and does a tremendous amount of damage. Now, to help you understand what's going on here with this, you have to understand that every drug and alcohol, though they affect a whole bunch of different brain chemicals, they affect one common chemical, which is dopamine. That's the same chemical that's affected by people with a food addiction, a gambling addiction, sex addiction. They all affect dopamine. And dopamine is the pleasure chemical of the brain. So whenever you do something that's pleasurable, the brain secretes dopamine and you get this, wow, that's good feeling. So you need to understand really what is going on. And if you can understand that, then you'll understand addiction. So I'm going to draw you a little graph with my hand. And basically, this is our graph here. And if we were to measure the amount of dopamine in your brain sitting there right now, we would say that's your normal setting. It's not like you're feeling great elation or depression, it's just normal. So we'll call that our bottom line on the graph, our 0. If you were then to take this evening and go out for your favorite supper, let's say steak and lobster, we could measure the amount of dopamine and we would just, for the sake of making a graph, call it 1. And then if you were to have your most favorite natural activity, and for most people that has a sexual component, what would be interesting, it would only be twice as much as your favorite meal. So we will call it 2. And the point is this, from sitting there doing nothing to going to your most favorite natural activity, the greatest, most pleasurable activity, our graph goes from 0 to 2. If you were to smoke crack or meth, the amount of dopamine using that scale jumps to 10 to 12. And that explains the huge rush that a person gets when they first smoke crack or meth. But the point is this, it's like taking a car that is made to run between 0 and 2,000 RPM and you're trying to run it at 10 to 12,000 RPM. It's not made to run there. And so something is going to break and the brain goes into panic mode because it says, if I don't do something quickly, I'm going to burn up. I'm not going to survive. So the brain does 2 things. Number 1, the brain says, let's start shutting down the dopamine factories in this brain. We got way too much dopamine happening here. Let's shut them down. So it starts to shut them down. So the next time the crack addict takes a hoot off his crack pipe, didn't get quite as much dopamine. So what does a good addict do? I'll just smoke a little bit more and a little bit more often to try and get. So you now don't have the natural dopamine. You now have the synthetic dopamine that's still up there in the 10 to 12. So the brain is no further ahead. So it has to do a second thing, and this is the key one. If you understand this, you understand addiction. The brain says if they want to make this amount of dopamine their normal, because that's what they keep pumping in, I will change chemically so that what used to be the 0 here, I will change so that that is now the 0. What used to be 10 to 12 will become 0. And now when a person smokes crack or meth or any drug, what happens is they don't even get a high anymore, they just feel normal. And that's because the brain has changed its chemical makeup in order to survive. The problem is that now the brain needs that huge amount of dopamine in order to be normal, because it's changed chemically to need that to be 0. And so what happens then when a person decides to quit? Well, the first thing, and I want to give you some hope, there's a picture of the brain after 1 year of not using. And to me that is absolutely amazing, because the amount of damage that is done through drugs and what we realize through brain scans is phenomenal. And to realize that God has created this organ that can heal itself is absolutely amazing. Within 2 years, the brain will heal itself about 95 to 98% of what it was. And that is absolutely amazing. But what happens when a person quits? not only does the brain start healing, but the person has powerful cravings. Let me give you just a couple things to help you appreciate that. There's been experiments done with lab rats, and what they've done is train the rats to push different levers to get different things. So if you push one lever, you get a pellet of food. Push another lever, you get some water. Another lever, you get a toy. And then they've put cocaine in one of the things. And the rat will actually stand there and push the cocaine button until it drops over dead. It'll stop eating, it'll stop drinking, it'll stop playing, because the brain now needs this huge amount of dopamine, and food, water, sex, none of those toys make it anymore. They don't do it, and so they will just stay with the cocaine until they drop dead. Another way to look at it is if you think of water. Your brain has kind of a normal setting for how much water your body needs to be healthy. And if that level drops below what it's needed, you get a craving or a thirst. We call it a thirst sensation. If you went for 2 or 3 days without any water, what happens? You get this massive craving. Your brain becomes obsessed with, I need water. I must have water to survive. I am prepared to do whatever it takes to get water. And that's what happens when the brain has become used to that much dopamine, and that is now the normal setting. You stop giving it dopamine, and it says, I need dopamine. I am prepared to lie, cheat, steal. I will even do that to my loved ones, to my grandma. I have to have dopamine, and the brain is convinced it must have that or else it'll die. And that explains what withdrawal is all about in the early days of getting off a drug, and that is why people do stuff that they never would before. The second thing that you need to realize when a person quits is that there's now no dopamine in the brain. You're not putting any synthetic dopamine in, and all the dopamine factories have been shut down. And so the brain goes through what we call anhedonia, which is just a Greek term to mean a pleasureless state. You do something that used to be pleasurable, and now you get no pleasure because there's no dopamine factories happening. And the tricky part is this. That goes on for 3 to 6 months. And so a person now in recovery says, I'm done with drugs and alcohol. I'm going to go straight. And a couple months in, no pleasure. About the 3rd month in, they go, you know what? I'm tired of living with no pleasure. Doesn't matter what I do, there's no pleasure. And it seems to me that the rest of my life is going to be an existence of no pleasure. I have to have some pleasure, and I only know one place to get it, and that's the drug. And so at about 3 months, about 90% of addicts relapse. And what they don't realize is if they just hung in there for another couple months, the brain would heal enough that they'd start to experience pleasure naturally again, but they get impatient and they relapse because they think life is a pleasureless existence. And that is just an important aspect in dealing with an addict, is for them to realize they're going to go through 3 months to 6 months of a tough stretch with not a lot of pleasure. There's a third thing that's really important to understand here. If you quit drugs and you stay clean and you get through that 3 months, and let's say you stay clean for 10 years. Within that first year, the brain will start to reset chemically back to where it used to be, so that you start to experience pleasure with the normal amounts of dopamine. So you stay clean for 10 years, and let's say you relapse. So you pick up one day, and there's this huge amount of dopamine comes flooding into the brain again. Want to know what happens? The brain goes, I remember what to do with that much dopamine. And within 1 day, the brain will change chemically back to where it used to be. And that's why when you talk to any long-term addict, they'll say they were clean for a while, they relapsed, and it was like they never quit. They just picked up where they left off. And that's because the brain remembers what it needs to do in order to be able to survive. Bottom line with that, addiction and relapse is all about chasing that dragon. And the reality is you'll never catch it, because the brain knows what to do with that much dopamine, and so you will continually chase it. Let me now give you what is known, or what we use as the characteristics of telling whether or not a person has become addicted. So how can you tell whether a person has a sex addiction or just a strong sex drive? How can you tell if a person is just abusing alcohol but not dependent on it, or whether they're truly addicted to alcohol? These 7 characteristics have to be true in order for an activity to be called an addiction or a drug or alcohol to be called addiction. Number 1, they have to lose control. And that is the person that says, you know what, I'm going to this social event, I'll have 1 beer. 10 beers later, they're still going. They can't control it once they have 1. It's the guy that says, I'll go on the internet and look at porn for 5 minutes. 5 hours later, they're still looking at it. Because once they set off that dopamine release, they cannot stop it, they lose control. The second thing is they obsess. It becomes an obsession. So they wake up in the morning, their first thoughts, how will I use today? Then the second thought is, how will I use without being caught today? How will I cover my tracks? And then after they've used, how will I recover from my using so that I can still function? And what happens is the drug or the activity becomes the center of their universe. Everything revolves around, how will I get the drug? How will I use the drug? How will I cover my tracks? How will I lie? All of those things, the drug becomes the center of the universe. The third thing, and this is the key one, they continue to use even though life is becoming more and more painful. There's more and more negative consequences happening, and they just keep on using. And a lot of times people ask me who aren't addicts, and they say, why don't they just quit? They've lost their job, they've lost their house, they've lost their marriage, and they keep on using. What's wrong with them? And they don't understand that once the brain is changed, the brain is convinced it needs it even though everything else is falling apart. And so they will continue to use despite all of these negative consequences piling up. Fourth is tolerance, and that's what we talked about. The brain adjusts. They need more and more to try and get the same high. And then the fifth is withdrawal distress. Most people can quit a drug or quit an activity for a couple days. And they think, oh, I got it under control. But during that time, they're starting to get panicky and antsy. How am I going to get it? I need it. I can't live without it much longer. And so that withdrawal distress just plays in their head. They got to have it. And it's big time. They Jones, we call it. The sixth one is guilt and shame. After they use, they hate themselves. I just stole from my kids' piggy banks. I just lied to my mother, whatever. And they hate themselves and they promise, I'll never do that again. That is the worst thing in the world to do. And they just make these promises and they really mean them. The problem is withdrawal hasn't set in yet. And as soon as withdrawal sets in, they forget all the promises because they got to have the drug, and the guilt and the shame just deepens. And then finally, they violate their morals and values. Stuff that they said they would never do, they now do. They will even come to the point of using needles, selling their body in order to get the drug, lying, stealing, robberies, all of those things. They begin to do stuff that they said they would never do. And as I deal with clients, the guilt that they experience because of what they put their children through, because of the stuff they've done, is just overwhelming. And so those are the things that have to be true of any activity or any drug, alcohol, in order for us to be able to say a person is truly addicted. So I want to give you the 2 definitions that have been used. The old definition was that addiction was a character flaw or a failure of the will. It was simply people who were weak in willpower. They just couldn't get their act together. And people always said, why don't you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and smarten up? But what we have now begun to see with the brain imaging and understanding what's happening in the brain is that addiction is a chronic, relapsing, brain-based condition associated with compulsive use of a substance or activity despite known negative consequences. Amongst professionals in addiction now, there's really not much debate about whether addiction is a brain disease or not. It is. The brain changes. The brain becomes sick. The brain becomes dependent upon the substance in order to feel normal. And once that happens, the person just does bizarre behavior, even though their world is falling apart. There's another thing I want you to realize. When we talk about different substances or activities and a person's relationship with them, we use the terms that we call levels of involvement. And there's different levels, and I just want to quickly cover it so that you understand the final point. Number one is non-involvement, and that's a person who just refuses to drink or gamble for health reasons, religious reasons. That's just not what they do, and they have their reasons. Then there's irregular involvement, and that's the teenager who's experimenting, and the point is there's no pattern. Or it's a person who maybe has a glass of wine once or twice a year, but there's no pattern. It's irregular. The third is regular involvement, and the point with that is there's a pattern now, but there's no harmful consequences. So this is the person who would maybe have one beer every night after work. That's all they have. They stop. It's a pattern, but it doesn't affect their life in a negative way. That's what they do. There's no negative consequences. Then the fourth is harmful involvement. Now the person, there's a pattern, but there's starting to be consequences that are harmful. It's starting to affect their health, their work, their relationships, their finances. And the person just is involved in a way that is harmful. But you need to understand that the person might not yet be addicted. The brain may not yet have changed. They're just abusing the substance or the activity, and it's starting to cause problems, but they're not dependent. And that's the fifth one. There's psychological and physical dependence. Psychological is, I think I need this to cope. So I'm going to a social gathering. I'm a little shy and nervous. I need a few beers to give me that liquid courage. Or I'm feeling stressed, or I'm having trouble sleeping. I need a few pills or a few drinks to help me relax. That's that psychological dependence. The physical is what I just described, where I abuse it to the point that the brain changes, and now the brain is dependent upon it. Now what I want you to see is if a person has become involved up to the harmful level and that's it, they can go back to earlier levels. They can go back to irregular involvement or regular involvement. But once a person becomes dependent, they can't go back to irregular or regular involvement. The only possibility for them is non-involvement, abstinence. Because as soon as they pick up and they start that dopamine happening, the brain changes back. And that is so hard, especially for a young person, to say, you mean I can't go back and just have a beer once in a while socially? Once the brain's changed, you can't do that. And that is really, really tough for young people to accept. So let me give you a couple final observations. Hopefully you've been able to see that once the brain changes, I am powerless to lick this thing on my own. I have to look outside of myself for help. And that is so important to realize that powerlessness, that I have a brain now that can't live without it. Secondly, addiction, if you think about it, and this is important to get, is a wrong belief about happiness. What does addiction believe? That happiness is found in pleasure. And there's no denying that pleasure does give happiness, but if all of my happiness is based on pleasure, then what happens in addiction? The more pleasure, therefore, you would think, the more happiness. And so addiction becomes all about more. If a little bit is good, then more is better. But it's all based on pleasure means happiness. But you want to know something? Pleasure does not equal happiness. People can live without pleasure and be very content, satisfied, happy people. They can experience joy that's deep down, that isn't dependent on pleasurable circumstances. And so what is very important to realize up front is that addiction is about finding happiness in the wrong place. And it's not until we find happiness in the right place that we'll ever truly find joy and deep contentment. And we're going to look at that in step 2, that the place to begin is God. And the final thing that I want to say with that is this. What the brain teaches us is that happiness and contentment is found in balance. God made us to be balanced. Addiction is about extremes. True joy, true happiness is found in finding a balance. And that's what we're going to look at in a couple sessions from now, is the balance that God designed in order for us to be happy. So that introduces the physical component. Next time we're going to look a little bit further at the brain, but let's just pray at this time. Father, I'm just thankful for this amazing brain that you have given us, but we realize that we, in addiction, are powerless to change. We need something outside of us, and the bottom line is we need you, and I pray that you would help people to begin to realize that they can't lick this on their own. They can't lick it through willpower. They need you. Amen.